Our session now is figures of speech, and our objectives include state how to identify figures of speech and the process involved in interpreting them. List and give 5 examples of specific types of figures of speech. Before we do that, I'd like you to share with me some of your proverbs or idiomatic expressions, or maybe figures of speech that you use in your country. So if I'm visiting and I just hear those expressions, I never know what they mean, and I'd be lost unless I ask you, of course, or unless you explain to me. If I take it literally, then I'd be very lost. I have a favorite expression or proverb here. I had no shoes and I complained until I met a man who had no feet. That's an Indian proverb. And then I have crossed the Rubicon. So I have made a final decision. That's referring to Caesar in 49 BC when he crossed the Rubicon. That started the war, his war with Pompey and the Roman state. I have 2 in Filipino or Tagalog. One is basa ang papel, literally wet paper, but that means a person has a bad record. And then the other one is walang dila. Literally, it means no tongue. The person has no tongue, or the meaning then is the person is shy and he doesn't want to talk. It is important to know this when you're visiting a country. And similarly, as we go into the Bible, it's important that we know some of the figures of speech in the Bible so that we will not be lost as we try to interpret the text of the Bible. So let's look at the definition of a figure of speech. A figure of speech is a word or a sentence that is thrown into a peculiar form, different from its original or simplest meaning or use. So a figure of speech, if you take it literally, you will be lost or confused. So there has to be a meaning to it that you need to know. Why do we need to know this figure of speech, or as it relates to the Bible, why do we need to know some of the figure of speech in the Bible? Would you read number 2, please? So figures of speech actually add color to communication or to a conversation. Let's look at the identification and interpretation of figures of speech. Letter A, identification. How are we to know when words are to be taken literally or figuratively? Bullinger explains, whenever, and it is possible, the words of Scripture are to be understood literally, but when a statement appears to be contrary to our experience or to known fact or revealed truth, or seems to be at variance with the general teachings of Scripture, then we may reasonably expect that some figure is employed. So if it doesn't make sense, if you take the word literally, then probably it's a figure of speech. Letter B, how do you interpret this? 1. Isolate the word or phrases that express the figure of speech. 2. Identify whether this is a figure of speech that involves comparison, substitution, or addition. 3. Give a label to the specific figure of speech. And 4. Bring out the intended meaning of or effect of the figure of speech. The figures of speech of the Bible includes substitution, addition, and comparison. Let's look at comparison. So when comparing, you have simile, a comparison using like or as. An example is on Psalm 1:3. He is like a tree planted by streams of water. 2 is metaphor. A thing is declared to be equal to another thing, like in Psalm 23 verse 1, which we are all familiar with. The Lord is equivalent to my shepherd. Hypocatastasis indicates substitution, an implied metaphor. Dogs, referring to evil men, have compassed me about. 4 is personification, representation or comparison of a non-human subject or abstract ideas as human. In Joel 1:10, the ground is mourning because the grain dried up. So ground or the earth is mourning. 5 is anthropomorphism, representation or comparison of God to some aspects as man. Face for presence or favor, eyes for awareness or observation, hand for power, care, and protection. And then human affections or feelings, Genesis 18:21, that I must go down and see if they are wicked as was reported. So, sight. 6 is zoomorphism, representation or comparison of God in the form of or with attributes of animals. Psalm 63:8, I rejoice under your wings. So, referring to God having wings. But that has to be taken as a figure of speech, of course. So that's for comparison. Let's look at substitution. I will just run through one example each. Metonymy, substitution of a thing for something that is closely associated. Of cause for the effect, the cause is stated but the effect is intended. Example would be agent or instrument for the effect. In Luke 16:29, Moses is taken for the writings of Moses. Letter B, of effect for cause. The effect is stated, but the cause is intended. Number 1, effect for agent or instrument. 57:8, glory for the tongue that renders it. Letter C, of subject or thing for attribute or adjunct of it. The subject is put for the attribute or adjunct of it. Example would be a seat of thing or action for the thing or action itself. Soul for desires, kidney for emotions or affections. Letter D, of adjunct or attribute for subject or thing. The attribute or the adjunct that pertains to it is put for the subject. I would look at signified for sign, separation for hair, and the name of person for the person himself, from his temple, from Zion, referring to help from God. And then contents for the container, prayer for the place of prayer. Synecdoche, substitution of a thing for something generically related to it. So of genus for species, general for the specific, flesh for creature of mankind. And then of species for genus, specific to general, bow or sword for weapon. And then of whole for part, the world for people of all sort. So these are just example for synecdoche. Then we have merism, the use of polar opposites to signify totality. So sit and rise for everyday activity. So even other examples would be heaven and earth. So it includes everything in it. And then euphemism, substituting a less offensive expression. So instead of saying death, you would say going to your forefathers or fathers. Instead of using the word for excretion, then it would be covering his feet. That's in Eglon, Judges 3:24. And then addition. Example would be hyperbole, a deliberate exaggeration or overstatement for emphasis or effect. Deuteronomy 1:28, great cities whose defenses appear to be as high as the heavens. So this would be an exaggeration here when the spies tried to describe the cities that they visited. And then Hyndaides, two terms are joined by a verb to form a single concept, and one of the terms define the other. So for instance, fire and brimstone, so your N is your verb, fire and brimstone would be for burning sulfur. And then in Genesis 3:16, pains in childbearing would be for labor pains. There are other figures of speech as well. Apostrophe, from description or a narration to direct address, like in Nehemiah to God, Psalm 6 to men, Joel to animals, Psalm 114 to inanimate things. Number 2 is irony, an expression in the form that conveys its opposite. So this is not what the prophet desired, but actually he's just saying, go to Bethel and rebel. At Gilgal, rebel some more. So that is not exactly what he wanted to happen here. And number 3, meiosis or light thoughts, a belittling of one thing to magnify another. In Numbers 13:33, the people were saying grasshopper, they look like grasshoppers versus the giants. And then in Isaiah 40:15, the nations are just like drop in a bucket versus God who is great. So this is just a run through of some of the figures of speech from addition, substitution, and comparison. I know that you have met these terms somewhere in your classes in biblical studies. So this is just a run through. And for your exercise, go through your assigned psalm, isolate the possible figures of speech, indicate if this figure involves comparison, substitution, and addition. What is the specific figure of speech used? Bring out the meaning that the figure of speech is communicating, and letter E, reflect this meaning in your translation and exegetical paper. Let's look back at Psalm 23. It's on the board. What are the figures of speech involved in Psalm 23? So we have seen in the example also in 23 verse 1, it's the Lord is my shepherd, there's nothing that I lack. So we have there a metaphor, and it's actually extended metaphor. And then 4 is a metonymy of the adjunct, sign for the signified. So your rod and your staff, they make me feel secure. So your rod represents care, and your staff or club represents defense. In verse 5 is the metonymy of the subject. You prepare a table for me. Okay, representing whatever is in the table. So the meaning there actually is feast, table, feast, anything that is on the table. I translated it in this way. You arrange a feast for me in the presence of my enemies. So table is put for the things on it, food and anything that the psalmist desired. So do this then. Analyze your psalm and look at the figures of speech that are present in your psalm or the text assigned to you.